Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to fulfill a request which I've gotten somewhat frequently, actually, since we started this channel, and that's recommended reading. Now, I've done some book reviews. I have, actually, when something wonderful comes across my lectern, whatever you want to call it, but I've avoided it up to this point because, well, I always say your time is better spent listening than like doing other things when we're talking about music. But let's face it. I mean, everybody loves a good read. I can't be a hypocrite about it. I've written 16 books myself, which I want all of you to go read, on everything from Leonard Bernstein to Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and all that stuff. Shostakovich. My goodness. So, yeah, of course, there are some amazingly fine books out there. I mean, like lots of them. And so once in a while, I think I'll put together a list for you and you can sink your eyeballs into it. It's going to take a while to get through it. These lists are not specific to, certain topics. They're general reading. They're about music and musicians, biography, musicology, all kinds of things at different levels, from rank beginner to people who are more knowledgeable. It's all going to get jumbled up, and you can go through the list and listen to my hopefully helpful descriptions and decide what you might want to read. On your Kindles now, or on your thingies, electronic reader things. I love Kindle, by the way. I really do. I mean, they're wonderful. I carry it around on the train when I go to work, and I read when I'm not listening to stuff back and forth, or sometimes I do both simultaneously, God forbid. Actually, I have to be honest. I always listen to music when I read. Always. And sometimes I find myself just staring at a page in a trance because I'm so enraptured by the music. At other times, I don't even remember what I was listening to because I've been so focused on the book. It's sort of hard to do both. But that was particularly true of Parsifal. I thought the only way I would get through Parsifal is if I read something else, because every time I tried to sit there and follow Parsifal with the libretto, I fell asleep. And so I actually did get through Parsifal reading something else, but I have no recollection of listening to Parsifal while I was reading the something else. Eventually, I dealt with my Parsifal blockage, but it took a while, and a lot of reading. I got through a lot of books that way. You can do a lot of book when you're listening to Parsifal. You really can. Anyway, be that as it may, the list is down below in the description of this video so that you have something that you can actually look at. You don't have to listen to me and wonder what I'm saying. And let's get started, shall we? First, Galina, a Russian story. This is the autobiography of Galina Vishnevskaya, the wife of Mstislav Rostropovich, friend of Shostakovich, the great Russian soprano of the middle 20th century, shall we say. An amazing, amazing person, and it's a fabulous read. An incredible story about how she navigated the Soviet system and all of the people she knew and met, and it's got a lot of history mixed in with it. It is probably the most compelling and amazing, you can't put it down, description of a musician's life in the Soviet Union that we'll ever encounter. And she was an amazing artist as well. I mean, I knew her, so that helped. But seriously, it's a tremendous book. It's one of those books where whether you like music or not, you're going to be saying to your friends, listen, you got to read this. I gave it to my mother. Everybody read it after I did, because it was just such an incredible book. And I knew the person who actually typed the whole thing and transcribed it for the editor. I mean, she wrote the whole thing out in longhand. It's all her, with some editing back and forth. But the most interesting thing about Galina, I think, for music lovers particularly, is the light it sheds on the life of Shostakovich. Now, there have been very, very, very extensive studies of Shostakovich and his life by writers like Laurel Fay and others. But, the controversy over testimony, which was supposed to be Shostakovich's memoirs, was really largely concerning whether or not it really was all written or narrated by Shostakovich. And the general consensus is that Volkov, who did testimony, sort of made a lot of it up in terms of what Shostakovich said. But what we learn from Galina is that his description of what was going on and his description of Shostakovich's feelings and the kind of guy he was is largely accurate. It really is. It may not be his words, but Galina backs up a lot of what is discussed in testimony, which is very, very helpful. It really, really is. But it also talks about a lot of other things besides. I mean, not needless to say, her career, although it's remarkably selfless, considering that we're dealing with artists, and then I went to La Scala and the reviews were fabulous. And the world was at my feet. And she's not into that. She's into carrying sacks of concrete during the siege of Leningrad. That's sort of where we are with her. So it's an incredible book. So that's number one. Number two, let's totally change focus. The Classical Style by Charles Rosen. Now this is a classic about the classical style. I mean, it's one of the great books ever written about a musical period. And even when I was very, very young, I was like 12 when I first read it. When it first came out, actually. And I know it was a billion miles over my head. It has lots of musical examples and some erudite musicological discussion and things like that, and harmonic analysis. And I still don't understand a lot of it. I really don't. But the passion and enthusiasm that informs the narrative bits is absolutely extraordinary. And it's an incredible work of synthesis, of putting together disparate elements to arrive at a really cogent description of the language of music in the classical period, that it's specifically about Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Now, part of the problem with any book that deals with one of these sort of limited subjects and is trying to make the strongest possible case for it is that it tends to dog others who are not, according to the author, Charles Rosen, who is one of those I have to be the smartest person in the room at all times guys, which is only made more annoying by the fact that he probably was the smartest person in the room at all times. But it is one of those books where if it doesn't fit my paradigm, it's not good. It's wrong. It's evil. It's bad. He feels that way about, for example, C.P.E. Bach or Boccherini, or it is not a description of the classical style as it actually happened in the classical period. It's a description of what we value today in the classical style from the point of view of the academic, certified progression of great composers, the canon of classical music. It's really about how the canon evolved. It's not a historical study. And that, once you get that into your head, you can read it with a little bit of criticism in your mind as well, which makes it all the more interesting because Rosen is he was a fabulous performer as well as a writer and polyglot kind of guy. So it's a wonderful book and a wonderful reference if you are interested in music by those three composers and what makes it special, what makes it, in a sense, different from what was happening in the classical period with everybody else. So that's number two. Number three, The Operas of Verdi by Julian Budden. Oh my goodness, this is fabulous. This is 3 volumes. And it just goes opera by opera by opera by opera by opera through all 30 some odd operas by Verdi, including the ones he redid in French and wrote for Paris and various editions and whatnot. It's a very lucid, readable, intelligent, wonderfully inviting description of the music. Absolutely fabulous. And it's great if you're trying to get into opera. It really is because it focuses very cogently on the elements of Verdi's style. And of course, Verdi is one of those composers you really need to get into because so many people, it's interesting, and when we look at the comments, people are always ready to talk about Wagner, Wagner gets all the attention because Wagner was Wagner. He was the German guy, and he wrote a lot, and he was, Verdi was not famous. Verdi just wrote operas. And you can almost see Verdi sort of smirking during these lofty conversations about Wagner, where Verdi's just saying, "Oh, just shut up and go to the theater, watch the damn thing and stop talking and start listening." You know what I mean? Because that's the kind of guy Verdi was. But he was, as he himself said, "I may not be a learned composer, but I am a very experienced one." And he was. And the story of how he began with, the sort of common coin of Italian operatic language. He wrote a comedy with secco recitative, with unaccompanied recitation in it, believe it or not. Up to Falstaff, his last opera, is really, really an extraordinary story, wonderful story. And there's so many terrific pieces you'll discover reading this. So that's what a really good book does. But it is 3 volumes, and it's long, and where you'll find it, well, in a library, who knows. But it's, I don't know whether these things are in print or not in print. And along similar lines, if you want to do it in 1 volume, there is Philip Gossett's Divas and Scholars. Now, this is very different from the Budden book, because Philip Gossett is the motive force behind the critical editions of Rossini and Verdi. And he passed away with his job as yet unfulfilled. Presumably it's still going on, and more volumes are forthcoming. But wow, what an amazing... I knew him pretty well as well, because I talked with him about the vibrato business and music performance practice and whatnot. He was very, very encouraging and supportive of what I was doing. He was an incredible force of nature, just a really powerful mind. And his story is like it reads like a detective story. It's how scholars put together critical editions of these repertory works of Italian operas, basically, and the amount of work it takes, and what you need to do, and the decisions you need to make, and where you find the material, and then what happens when you bump up against the entrenched traditions of performance of those same works, and what the divas do to the hard work that you've managed to achieve in order to make it more amenable to themselves, which is, of course, the eternal question, because all of this stuff, especially in opera, was crafted to meet the demands of the singers who are going to perform it. And sometimes that works really well when all the singers are on the same page with the musicologists, and sometimes it doesn't. The evil villain of this story is Beverly Sills, who never met an opera that she wouldn't do in the way she wanted to do it, apparently, and whose teacher came from what Philip Gossett regarded as the evil, decadent, old, crappy tradition of Tweedy sopranos. And it's just wonderful. But it's really, really a fabulous book, and he makes what he does sound so damn interesting. So that's an incredible one. And then up here, now we're going back to sort of musicology / history. Stravinsky and the Russian Traditions by Richard Taruskin. Now, Richard Taruskin is almost more famous as a gadfly in the musical establishment, somebody who wrote the first great and wonderfully biting critique of the period instrument movement. He insisted correctly that they had nothing to do with the period, that they were all just modern people doing things in a modern way. And he was right, of course. But he could be kind of obnoxious, and he dabbled in music criticism, not very successfully, I think. And record criticism. The stuff that I do. And he made a lot of enemies, and as like so many things happened with people in academia and the musical culture, there were aspersions cast on him for sort of sexual peccadillos, and we don't need to go into any of that. We really don't. He was a brilliant musical scholar, musical mind, and he actually was a scholar of Russian music. That's what he did. And when he did that, he was phenomenal. He published that Oxford History of Western Music, whatever it was terrible, horribly edited, full of mistakes. he fell in love with his own ego and reputation and whatnot, and got, I think, rather careless and sloppy in the way he had grad students obviously doing the work he should have been doing. But Stravinsky in the Russian Traditions is, I think, his masterpiece. It's a couple of volumes as well, and it's really, really phenomenal. As a description of the musical culture of Russia and Stravinsky's relationship to it. And Stravinsky, you have to love Stravinsky, of course, but I mean, Stravinsky was a major, major voice. And one of the things that I learned immediately from reading this book is that Stravinsky relied on models. He modeled things. In other words, he took something else and then he turned it into Stravinsky. And Taruskin is wonderful at describing those models, what they were, and how Stravinsky handled them. What he is not wonderful at is very similar to Charles Rosen. That is, when he finds a work that doesn't fit his paradigm, then he dismisses it. In this case, the work is Pulcinella, because it's not Russian at all. It's based on Italian Baroque music, Stravinskified, and he really felt that that was completely illegitimate in some way, but that doesn't matter. It's an incredible, incredible read. It's a little difficult. It's long. It's detailed, but it's absolutely splendid. Now we go back to some good old fashioned biography. Otto Klemperer, His Life and Times by Peter Heyworth in 2 volumes. This is absolutely one of the best conductor or artist biographies by someone else, not an autobiography, that you're going to read. It's a wonderful story too, because Klemperer, as you know, was manic depressive, and so he had high points and low points. His life was insane. It really was nuts, and he was in the center of German musical life during the Weimar period as director of the Kroll Opera, which did all kinds of contemporary and modern stuff, and also rediscovering early music and Bach. And Klemperer was an amazing person. He was not just the grand old man of granitic Beethoven and Brahms that we know from his last recordings, from his late recordings. He was a revolutionary, a radical. And of course, he got his career, start by Mahler, and he was a devotee of Mahler, and a very, very interesting personality, aside from being manic depressive. I mean, he really was. So it's a fascinating biography of a major, major conductor whose life was very, very different from the impression you may gain from listening to those late recordings. It's definitely, it's going to be a revelation if you read it. There's also a sort of adjunct, Conversations with Klemperer, a small little book which he put out that involves actual transcriptions of conversations, interviews with Otto Klemperer. That's interesting too if you want to get your hands on it. But the biography is the thing, and it's a very impressive one. Another extraordinarily impressive artist biography is Franz Liszt by Alan Walker. 3 volumes, 3 big chunky volumes, and they have names. It's the virtuoso years and the final years and the bidding, one of those things. But it's Franz Liszt by Alan Walker in 3 big volumes. It's brilliantly researched, incredibly well written, very, very readable, enjoyably readable, which you would know if I've met Alan Walker as well at a symposium or two. A delightful person, a convivial person, someone who's really a joy to talk to. And you get that reading this biography. And Liszt himself, the topic, look, you may like Liszt's music, you may dislike Liszt's music, but he's another one who was at the absolute center of European musical life and musical culture. All of it. I mean, his life was unbelievable, from his beginnings in Austro-Hungary to his youth in Paris, the beginnings of his virtuoso career in Paris, and then his crazy life running around as the first great traveling concert pianist with his own piano in those days when you had to attach it to your horse and buggy and drag it all over Europe. I mean, really, it was astonishing, the things that he did. And then as a composer, as a radical composer, as Wagner's son-in-law, and his relationships with his women. And oh my God. And then the Weimar period, where he had the whole musical world coming to him for lessons in wisdom, and his annual pilgrimages between Weimar and Rome and Hungary. And sheesh. I mean, how he had time for any of this, it's incredible. It's really, really, really incredible. And all the vile and obnoxious people around him, including his own daughter, Cosima and Wagner and von Bülow, and these, oh my God, it's just incredible. So, whether you like Liszt or not, if you want to know, like, music in Central Europe, you have to read Alan Walker. It's a fantastic biography, absolutely first rate. Next, we come to one of the greatest books ever written by a musician, and that's Berlioz, Evenings with the Orchestra. This is one of the funniest books anybody ever wrote. Berlioz was not just a genius as a composer, but he was actually as good a writer as he was a composer, and as quirky and interesting a writer as he was a composer. I mean, goodness gracious, this book is hilarious. He had a rapier sharp wit, and a critic's eye, and a phenomenal critic's ear, pardon me, whatever. But Evenings with the Orchestra is a fictitious book about a provincial opera orchestra in a schlumpy little town that performs all of the greatest hits of the day, and Berlioz is the raconteur who goes and he's friendly with members of the orchestra. And as the performances go on, the orchestra members become so bored with what's happening that they just stop playing and they sit around and they tell stories. And he gets invited to sort of lean over the edge of the pit, or if they have a pit in those days, or sort of move his chair close to where the orchestra was, because they didn't have pits in those days. The orchestra just sat on the floor, so you could get really close to them. And they hang out in this little sort of coffee clatch, and they tell stories about well, all kinds of things. I mean, just unbelievably demented things. And he's making merciless fun of musical standards and the musical life of his time. And it is phenomenal. I mean, it's indescribable, really. You have to read it. You have to read it. But it is very, very funny and extraordinarily witty. And it comes in evenings, little small little bits. And every so often something good happens, like they do Beethoven's Fidelio and they don't talk. They actually play because the music is great, of course. And, Berlioz is a big fan of Beethoven and Weber and people like that. He hates Italian opera, of course, because that's everybody who wasn't Italian in Europe hated Italian opera because it was popular. And because that's what was getting played, and that's what people wanted to hear. The most important member of the orchestra, of course, according to Berlioz, is the player of the bass drum, who is miserable whenever they do something that doesn't include the king of instruments, the bass drum. Because Italian opera is just thumpity, thumpity, thump. Oh, it's just great. So if you haven't read Evenings with the Orchestra, not only have you missed out on one of the greatest examples of musical humor, or humor in literature, and critical writing as well, but you really don't know something about Berlioz. It'll change your whole view of the man to hear just how witty and sharp he was. He didn't like writing. He wanted to compose, of course, but as a composer, he was not terribly successful in his lifetime, so he wound up having to write all kinds of stuff. And there's also a fabulous autobiography and all kinds of other writings and things that he did, and they are wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Berlioz is someone you really ought to be reading as well as listening to. Totally as opposed to Wagner, whose writings are more voluminous also than his musical stuff, but so much of it is just garbage because it's all about himself. It's all philosophical hoo-ha. But there are some good things in Wagner as well. Maybe we'll get to them in one of these chats. Anyway, next. Absolutely. This is one of the most riveting. This is like Galina. It's up there. It's called 100 Miracles, a memoir of music and survival. This is the autobiography of Czech harpsichordist Zuzana Ruzickova, who some of you may not know or may not have heard of because she's not, the biggest name in the biz these days, but she recorded the complete keyboard works of Bach for Otto. She was a brilliant, brilliant artist, but more importantly for our purposes, or just as importantly, let's put it that way, she was a Holocaust survivor, and her story is indescribable, what she went through. I mean, she was interned in Theresienstadt. She wound up in Auschwitz, where she had to deal with Joseph Mengele, the evil experimenter on human beings guy. She was slated to be gassed. She got out at the last minute. She was forced to do slave labor in Hamburg in the latter part of the war as the Germans were losing and bombs were falling all over the place. Then she was finally interned at Bergen-Belsen and left to die with her mother. And she survived. She managed to survive, only to go back to Czechoslovakia and find out that she was an outcast because no one expected anyone to come back and didn't know how to deal with them. And her hands were ruined, and she had to relearn her entire technique to become a performer. She was one of the first major performers on the harpsichord. She was the first after Wanda Landowska, actually, who she was supposed to study with at one point but couldn't do it. And then the communists took over, and she wouldn't join the party, and she was persecuted relentlessly for A, not being a communist, and B, being a Jew. She was not permitted to perform with the Czech Philharmonic because Karel Anschel was the conductor, and they said, we already have one Jew, and there's no room for any more. I mean, it's unbelievable. And she lived until a few years ago. So she survived all of it. She made it to like her 90s. And her story, which she tells, in conjunction with Wendy Holden, who wrote everything down with her, is just, holy boy, oh boy. I mean, it should be mandatory reading for anybody who cares about anything, actually. I mean, when she had to go, after she rebuilt her career, and she was invited to take part in a competition in Germany. And the idea, think about it, of someone who had just recently survived the Holocaust, rebuilt her career, and then has to go perform in Germany as a tool of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. I mean, it's like, you can't even wrap your brain around the dementedness of the whole thing. And she comes out as just this almost angelic figure. And I'm not into hagiographies, but if anybody deserved it, she did. She was somehow, she said it herself. She said she had a very happy childhood. She said, if you have a happy childhood, then you can deal with whatever comes later in life. It sets you up for the rest of your life. And it worked for her. But the book alternates between scenes in the camps in World War II and that situation and her life in communist Czechoslovakia, which is just unremittingly grim. And it's really something else. It's an incredible book. If you haven't read it, it's still in print as of now. You should definitely see it. And you should also have a look at the documentary about her on YouTube. I mean, it's just an incredible story. And she was one hell of a Bach harpsichordist. A harpsichordist, a keyboard artist, generally a fabulous artist. Her Bach recordings are marvelous, marvelous. So, yeah, and so was everything else she did, just about. Really terrific. And last but not least, this is a history, a musicological history, music in European capitals. Now, this is a series of 3 books about, similar to what Charles Rosen does, but it's much broader. It's much easier to read for a general audience. It's much less musicologically focused on tiny details, although it has those. It's by Daniel Heartz, the late Daniel Heartz, who was a wonderful musicologist. He was a colleague of Taruskin's at UC Berkeley. And there are 3 volumes in this series. It's the early Beethoven, and then it's Haydn and Mozart, and then music in European capitals, the Galant style, which is the volume that I've chosen, because it deals with a period, 1720 to 1780, that's between the high Baroque and the high classical. It's one of those in-betweeny periods, and it happens to have some amazing, amazing composers. You've got the whole Mannheim school, the Stamitzes and those folks. You've got C.P.E. Bach out in northern Germany and Berlin and Hamburg. You've got Boccherini. You've got, really, the European capitals, Paris and Madrid and Italy and, the various capitals of the states of Italy at that time. Really a phenomenal survey of tons and tons and tons of music, and a fascinating period of ferment when musical styles were changing and there were local traditions that were becoming international. And, oh my gosh, it's nifty. It's just wonderful. And it really talks about the different musical situations in each of these wonderful cities. And it's such a fascinating book. If you're looking to enrich your knowledge of this particular period, it brings to life so much music that you can explore on your own. So there you have it, my friends. There's 10 really serious books that will take you years to get through. We'll do another list sometime. We'll do more. And if you have suggestions for things that you think belong on the list, please feel free to make them. I'm always interested in your suggestions, and I'm always interested in a good read, just like you are. And I can't pretend to have even begun to read as much as I should have. We don't have time for any of this, do we? All the music, all the books, all the work, all the scholarly productions. It's a lifetime. It's a lifetime for these scholars, and it's more than a lifetime for us. It's hundreds of lifetimes. But we can dip and enjoy as we please. We'll dip into them, and I'll try and sift through them and make some recommendations that will enrich your lives as they have enriched mine. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.